describing the main results of her dissertation. And if I could just editorialize a bit at the start and say that I think that for several years I encouraged people to work on the emergence of institutions, and I can never get any good bites. But I'm very happy that Elaine took this on. It's not an easy problem. My sense is, though, this is a problem which conventional social science does a very poor job on. How to get multi-agent institutions to form, emerge, evolve, etc. And Elaine has a good first step at it. This is not the final word, but it's a
way along the path, maybe.
Okay, take it away, Elaine.
Okay, so my work agentizes. So basically, before me, there was certainly the eminent Acemoglu and Robinson, and they created game theoretic models in order to explore the incentives and interactions that lead to creation and consolidation of democracy. So my work then is taking that and trying to agentize that and see if we can learn something else through an agentization methodology. There's been a lot of work on institutions, but as Rob says, it's mostly, kind of theoretical, kind of positioning type of papers and work. And they found that a way, though, they're trying to say a way that the society organizes itself. So whether governance is just a way of people organizing themselves so that as a group you get benefits from that group. And they say that the way a society does organize itself through, political institutions, economic institutions, they actually influence then the benefits to the group. So it's not just the quality of the people, but it's also the way of organizing which will influence the benefits to the group. And Acemoglu and Robinson developed a theory on the creation and consolidation of democracy through a game theoretic framework. They studied how economic incentives influence the way social groups shape institutions to allocate political and economic power. So they say it's all in the money, and that it really is the benefits of, who wins in the redistribution of the income and the wealth of society. The A&R models, though, they assume groups of people are completely rational, because that's, the basis of game theoretic models, and that they are identical intra-group in order to make the models mathematically tractable. So my dissertation then utilizes an agent-based computational methodology. It reproduces a subset of the A&R models with the same restrictions in order to validate the model. And then I used a more flexible computational methodology to relax those restrictions and get a more realistic set of assumptions like heterogeneous incomes. And that allows me to explore, things like what then would a middle class have to do? Because the way, with their model, they have rich and poor. And it's like, well, what happens when you have a middle class? Most societies have a middle class now. So governance institutions. This is all about governance institutions. The research has been largely descriptive. We have, North, Weingast, Lipset, Solo. The empirics of governance were explored by Alessino, Barrow, and I'm sorry, Easterly, and very famous people. When they explore the empirics, though, they have to aggregate the results. They're looking really pretty much at regressions at the country level. Say which countries, but it does add some value. I mean, they're saying that when doing those type of regressions, they can say things that are favorable to economic growth include education, lack of corruption. They know corruption definitely hurts growth. The rule of law has been found to be very important. Natural resources, geography, the fiscal policy, technological progress, and just stable institutions, because if you have a lot of instability, that wears down, that's very costly, and it wears down on the growth of the country. What they're missing, though, is the description, behind all of that. It doesn't just happen. A country can't make growth. There's people behind it. And the people have to have their incentives and human mechanisms which would then promote the economic growth. So the big picture is all about, one way or another, this is all about trying to get to modeling the emergence of governance institutions. And we really are trying to ask questions or answer questions like, how do you produce sustainable societies? How do you avoid the tragedy of the commons, you know, where people won't support or help each other because there's not enough benefit for themselves, even though if everyone pitched in, it has great benefits for the whole. Is there a typical life cycle for institutions? When should they increase their size and their capabilities to take on more? When is that beneficial for them to take on more? And, you know, when do institutions fail? And clearly, you know, coups and revolutions are all examples of an institution that is failing, at least for some of the people. So Acemoglu and Robinson's, they work this problem with a game theoretic framework. To them, governance is a game played between the social classes. And the players evaluate the utility of their options. You know, do I have a revolution? Do I stay? Do I pay taxes? Or do I have a coup and take back this country because I don't want to pay the taxes anymore? They evaluate the utility of their options using the best response, assuming the best response of the other class in that situation. And they solve for the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium that yields distinct governance regimes, whether it's a democracy or dictatorship. And
when were Acemoglu and Robinson writing? That sounds remarkably Marxist. I'm like, you know, the deterministic of the social classic, you know, determined.
2005, 2006.
Okay, right.
Somewhere around there.
Right.
Yeah, it's not Marxist because it does not end with the proletarians taking over the world.
No, but it's saying it's only a matter of time. It's saying, you know, okay, that these social classes are clearly defined, and it's only a matter of time that they will eventually rise up.
So they've defined these possible paths to democracy, and basically based on inequality. When the inequality gets high enough, then the people are incented to say, you know, this isn't fair, something has to be done. However, if the cost of repression is low enough, then the elites will repress, such as even with high inequality, and you still don't have revolution, such as what had happened in South Africa. This area here is where you have pretty low inequality, and even if the costs of repression are high, you just have political status quo because they're not incentive to have a revolution. This section here is the section here when you have low cost of repression, then the elites will repress, so nothing happens. When you get higher costs of repression, they can't afford to repress. They may then offer concessions such as, okay, we'll have some redistribution. You know, we'll pay for public schooling for kindergartners and things like that. So you offer some tax concessions. At some point, that's not enough because the people will say, well, just because you offer tax concession this year, you might not next year. Okay, and then that causes them, you know, to still threaten revolution, and then it's in the elite's best interest to install a democracy, because that's how you then commit to future tax redistributions. So without a democracy, the elites, sure, they give you the tax concession this year, next year they won't. And I'll discuss that again on another slide. Any other questions on this?
Basically, and on you figure they're going to solve for kind of what is the critical theta star and what is the mu. The models will produce those kinds of.
Yes, the models produce. So the mu is the cost of revolution. So when the cost of revolution is less than the inequality, then you can make a threat of revolution. If the cost of revolution is greater than the inequality, then it's not credible that you have that threat, because you're not going to have to get the benefit from it. And the theta star, that's just the critical value of inequality between when they have to actually commit to these pro-citizen policies for a longer term, such as by installing a democracy. All right, so governance is an economic choice. So it's not, you know, it is people choose how they want to govern themselves. It allocates political and economic power. Policy choices have distributional impact, and there can, even with distribution, even with taxes, depending on how the governance is set up, different components of society is going to benefit differently, from those taxes. And so it inherently creates conflict. Classes use their political power to get favorable economic policies. So this is a top-down, Acemoglu and Robinson worked on a top-down formulation. They look at the country-level characteristics and aggregate behavior, and they're kind of looking at it from a God's eye point of view. When really we know from the work is that governance really is a bottom-up process. People decide how to govern themselves, and descriptive work from this point of view is like Ostrom's from the what was the name of her book?
Managing commons?
I think it was, yes, where the self-governing groups, they craft the rules of the game, so to speak. And in this case, the rules of the game is governance, and it's the rules around that governance. And they design institutions that structure the economic and social incentives to increase the benefits to the group. So what's missing, in the literature is this bottom-up model for how agents figure out for themselves how they're going to govern through some sort of iterative process. So the research objective is to grow self-governance institutions. I'm not growing self-governance institutions, but I'm making a step forward towards that path. The approach is to render Acemoglu and Robinson's game theoretic model using agent-based computational methodology. And the way we do this is, Rob and I forget, produced a paper on docking. And so basically what I want to do is that I produce the A&R results with my agent-based model, doing kind of the same limitations on the assumptions, the same assumptions they have. That way I can dock it and people can trust my model. They can verify, yep, I'm getting the same results. Then I can begin to relax the assumptions and then show, well, in what situations do we get different results? That you couldn't figure out from just the game theoretic. And then in the future, we want to move towards more general models describing the emergence of self-governance institutions. You all are here, so you all know about agent-based models. And the agentization is, as I said, so you take a conventional model, you reproduce the results, thus the ABM is docked, and then you generalize. And as we know, if the model is simple, it may only explain very simple events. We may not need a model, but the model is complicated, it may get too specialized. You're trying to find, the right area of the model is all part of the journey as well. Where it's simple enough to fit a variety of behaviors, but complex enough to fit behaviors that need the help of an explanatory model. Let's see. So the diagram to the right shows the picture as drawn by the agent-based model. It has the same 5 sections as what Acemoglu and Robinson did in their book. So, so in my dissertation, I did find I could get the exact same sections, that there are certain areas where there is no threat, it's a status quo. Then there's areas where there is threat, and so you get some concessions from the elites. The area in white is where you get repression, because the cost of repression are low. And then there's a point where inequality is high enough and the cost of repression is high enough that they actually have to go ahead and democratize.
So in the Acemoglu and Robinson, as a game, there are still actors, right? So is it the whole social class as an actor in the game? Or?
So in the mathematical model, there is one actor, and a percentage of that actor is the elite, and the percentage of the actor is the poor. So it's basically a 1. And that's just mathematically, that's how they do it.
Okay. I'm just thinking of kind of the standard 2-dimensional.
Yeah, so they don't actually have 2 actors that are competing against one another, like normal game theory?
No, they do.
Okay.
So let me get into that, and I'll show you how they set that up. So classes use their political power to change economic policies in their favor. The poor want redistribution of income. De jure power is allocated by the governing institutions, so there's a difference between de jure power and de facto power. And this gets also into the point of whether you offer concessions or whether you have to change it to be a democracy. So if the elite keep de jure power, that means they keep the governance, they own the governing institutions, and the poor can use de facto power to get some policy concessions, but the poor won't have de jure power to get that commitment of those concessions until you get a democratization, until you get a changing of the rules of the game. So that's what de jure power refer to, the real rules of the game. De facto power is through influence and, what kind of threats and pressures can you put on them. And revolution is when the poor use violence to gain control of the political institution. A coup is when the elites use violence to overthrow the democracy and return it to a non-democracy.
I wonder if it would be useful, Elaine, just to, it's with the discussion at this level, it covers every possible, version of this. I wonder if it would be useful just to spend like 1 minute, 2 minutes discussing, there have been key points in history where it's thought that some of these things played out, right? For example, like in North talked a lot about the Glorious Revolution of 1688, I think, right? That's so that's one example.
And even before that, an interesting thing were the peasant revolts, which was very critical in that they successfully, had a revolt. They gained some concessions by the king. By the time they went back to their villages, the concessions were all thrown out the window. They were all arrested and tried and killed because the people had dispersed. So the threat of revolution was no longer there.
Look at Magna Carta. I mean, that was a sort of a
That was
watershed
between the
moment.
king and the nobles, not the
But
king and the
well,
peasants.
it's still a class.
It was two different classes, right? The king versus the elite.
Sure.
So the king was grabbing too much power, in their opinion, so they wanted to take some of it back.
Sure, and so that was, I don't know if Acemoglu and Robinson get into that. That would be like dispersing the chance of a coup, I would assume.
Right.
Using his terminology.
So, right, so in order to make sure that you get continued concessions, you need to restrict the discretion of the ruler. And so that is what the Magna Carta would do.
There
That
were
sort of rules
concessions there.
yes, and it restricts the discretionary behavior that the ruler can do. And there's a lot of, if you look in like the Polity 4 data set that describes the different types of governance institutions, and they classify, and they classified all, like 170 countries for the last 40 years and different, and they expressly, discuss things like what is the discretion, how well controlled are the rulers, how open is the society to new parties and coming in and competing politically. So the change in political institutions provides this credible commitment. Without a change in political institutions, it's not credible, because once the threat is no longer there, well, then they no longer have to follow through with their promises. So the incentives for elites to overthrow, a couple of things that they did find is the incentives for elites to overthrow a democracy, so this has to do with coup, and depends on the individual benefits of one regime versus another, given the redistribution of qualities, so depending on, how much taxes get taken out and how that tax is distributed. So it depends on that, but it also depends on the ability for the citizens to solve their collective action problem, because for them to mount a threat of revolution, you have to solve the collective action problem. So one of the things countries like Singapore, some of these Asian countries do, is that they make it impossible to organize via Facebook. They're monitoring everything because they need to reduce the citizens' ability to mount a threat. And then the ability of the institutions then to solve the credible commitment problems. Some countries, even like in Iraq, this was a big problem with Iraq when they're standing up for democracy in Iraq, is that even though they said that You know, they may have a rule like all children, you know, men and women are gonna be educated, you know, male, female, they're all gonna be educated. But the people knew, and I'm just using this as an example, they knew though that that would not be enforceable. And so, even though you say you have this institution, it still isn't credible. It's not enough to overcome the credible commitment problem. And so then, you know, people then make their decisions then based on that. They may be then more likely to continue with revolution because what you've set up as a governing institution still doesn't meet their needs. So I'm gonna have a couple slides in which I'm gonna go into details of game theory, and I might answer part of that question about how they set it up, you know, with the game theoretic network. So just, you know, background, whenever there is competition for a resource, game theory can be used to both explain existing behavior and to improve strategies. So as an example of explaining existing behaviors, you can explain then how cooperation arises, you know, for the sake of mutual benefit. Companies also use it for a strategical situation and to improve that in terms of market strategies. The subject of game theory are situations where the result of one player depends not only on his own decisions but also on the decisions of others. So that's why you're looking at best response. You're going to assume everyone else is rational, and you make your decisions based on their best response. And the Nash equilibrium is when no player has anything to gain by changing strategies. Nash, you know, famously proved that every game has at least one mixed strategy, Nash equilibrium. So this is the example of a payoff matrix. This is a normal form game. It's a single interaction. Both players choose their strategy simultaneously. You can represent it by a payoff matrix in this particular case, and this came from Rob's CSS 610 class. So if you've taken that, you will recognize this. This shows two Nash equilibria. This one is Pareto optimal. These are the strategies, A versus B. This is the role player. They have strategies A versus B as well. The extensive form game is when they execute their moves consecutively. So in this case with Acemoglu and Robinson, they show a extensive form game for their consolidation of democracy, where the rich would choose either to repress, if there's a threat of revolution, the rich will either repress or they have a democracy, or they may keep it as a non-democracy. So they get these three choices, and then the poor, if it's a democracy, they then choose what tax they want. If the tax is too high, they know that the rich may then have a coup, so they have to set the right tax. But if the tax is too low, they may not get what they need, and then the poor, another factor, the poor may go continue to have another revolution to try to get better terms. So if it's non-democracy, the rich then set the tax. If they keep it too low, the poor may have a revolution. And you know, and it just goes on. You just, you know, you set it. Each one of these has a value, a utility, and he then compares the utility and you figure out the best response. Subgame perfect. I think I'd used that earlier in the slide. So, and this has to do with credible commitments. And you may remember this also from Rob's class. But it was very well described, Rob, so thank you. So it's a subset of Nash equilibria that are credible. The subgame perfect equilibrium represents a Nash equilibrium for every subgame of the original game. So in this particular instance, A is not going to choose, let's see if I can remember this correctly. This is the subgame perfect equilibrium because this is not credible. You can't assume, let's see if I can explain this correctly. So player 2, this player, may want to influence 1 to say, you better go ahead and choose B, because if you choose A, then I'm going to choose L, and then you are worse off, because here you at least get a 1. So you better go choose B, that way you know you're going to get a 1 and you're not going to choose, get down to this 0. But this threat is not credible because then player 2 would also get a 0, and that they really aren't going to choose this option. They're really going to end up choosing this. And this person knows it, so he's not going to go, player one's not gonna choose B, he's gonna go ahead and choose A. And this is gonna end up being the Nash equilibrium. Okay, I tried. And it's the same thing, with the A&R models. The elites may promise redistribution in step one. They may promise it, however, if the promise is not credible, because by the time you get there for the next year, you know, the threat of revolution, people have gone back to their villages. The threat of revolution now is down, you know, everyone's happy, then they'll just renege on the promises. But, you know, the poor now, since the peasant revolution was a learning point, and I think it did get taught in a lot of schools, and they're not, you know, they're not dumb. They know that if they don't get it, if they don't get some sort of, and it doesn't have to be a democracy, there's other ways in your institutions to enforce a continued, you know, commitment, but you just have to find the right way to do that. Let's see. So now we get on to repeated games, and good strategies for repeated games do not necessarily resemble the good strategy for the same game played once. So when you do the democratization game, you can't just look at this year, you know, what is best for you. I mean, you have to think about 10 years in the future, infinite, and the way you do it in game theory, the way they make the math mathematically tractable is that you look at it for an infinite number of years in the future. So if this is the matrix, then the payoff for stag would be the probability of selecting stag times the payoff, which is 10, plus the probability of selecting rabbit, plus times the payoff, which is 0. And so the payoff for choosing stag would be 4, and the payoff for choosing rabbit would be 6.8. So the solution is a mixed strategy. So this is what is talked about in terms of a mixed strategy, where you then do a percentage. You would then play rabbit 6.8 divided by 4 plus 6.8, or 63% of the time, and you would play stag 39% of the time. So let me talk a little bit about the collective action problem. So it was Weingast who suggested that enforcing the rules of a democracy is a collective action problem among the citizens. The problem requires that the citizens agree on limited powers of the state. And it's a difficult problem because citizens tend to be in disagreement on a lot of things for key policy areas, and yet they have to coordinate their response to a violation of democratic rights in order to bring the right incentives to the elites or to the people in power to follow the rules. So the revolution may be costly to a group, but it could be beneficial to the whole group if they have that revolution. So how do you solve that collective action problem? One of the things he found is that inequality has to be high enough to make it worthwhile. And also that this credible threat of revolution has to be sustained. Otherwise, the elites are not incented to adopt pro-citizen policies. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the credible commitment problem. So elites can promise redistribution for this current period of time, but they're not credible without restraints on the executive discretion through the governing institutions. A&R models the credible commitment by having each person calculating their benefit of the current promise as a benefit that time period, plus the discounted value. So you take the discount rate of looking into the future for what then might happen in the future. Because in the future, the current policies may continue or they may change. And I will give you an example of that. Alright, so for dynamic games, players look into the infinite future, they solve for the best response. You get something called a Bellman equation. So this says the utility of the rich in a non-democracy with a low threat of revolution is equal to your income plus, because it's a low threat of revolution, so you get your income if you're rich. So that's there, that's what you get for this year. And then looking into the future, there is Q, which is the probability of in the future you may actually have a democracy. Let me go, you have to solve it iteratively. In the future you may either have a democracy or you may stay as a non-democracy. So it's the benefit of the rich in a democracy and the benefit of the rich in a non-democracy, you're gonna be in a democracy Q percentage of the time, and in a non-democracy 1 minus Q percentage of the time. And then so you find that it actually is a recursive situation where the benefits of the rich in a non-democracy is the discounted rate of the probability of switching to a democracy plus the probability of staying in a non-democracy, and then you can just solve that recursively. You get another equation for this guy, and now you have two equations with two unknowns, and you can solve it, and you get this mess right here. Now, how many of you think when there is a revolution that every single peasant is sitting down and figuring all this out to figure out their utility?
No.
There's one person.
One.
They're very intelligent.
They're very intelligent peasants.
Very well schooled.
So that's one of the. So there's other ways of knowing this, and you can know this by talking with people and just figuring out, you know, what is the mood of the people and stuff, and that kind of helps guide your decision versus actually doing this calculations, and these calculations aren't really very happy for agent-based modelers anyway. But I did use these calculations to be able to dock my model to the Acemoglu and Robinson model, just so I could show and we can gain trust that this model is doing what their model does. So now let's see what we can do. What can we relax? Any questions on that? They're called Bellman equations.
I assume that there's a similar equation for the poor.
Yes, there's a similar equation for the poor, and you have to solve these equations for all the different cases, all the different states. So what is the utility of the rich in a democracy? What is the utility of the rich in a democracy with a high chance of coup versus a democracy with a low chance of coup? What is the utility in a non-democracy with a high chance of revolution as well as the low chance of revolution?
So your assumptions of parameters here basically determine what the payoffs are in your matrix, right?
These parameters here exactly determine what the payoffs are going to be, yep, as well as beta, what the discount rate is. So if there's high inflation, things like that, that's going to affect the likelihood of revolution. So the assumptions of the Acemoglu and Robinson model that I then built also into the ABM is, well, in their case, it's only one agent, so I can't actually do one agent in an agent-based model. So I have N agents, but I keep the same delta. There's delta rich agents, 1 minus delta poor agents. The median voter then, since there's more poor agents than rich agents, the median voter is always going to be the poor agent. Inequality is described as the top delta percent of citizens, and they receive beta percent of the total income. So the value we use as in the slider is theta. So what percent does the top, so you can say the top 10% of agents have 30% of the income, or the top 5% of the agents have, 15% of the income. Those types are used in literature today, in articles. They explain the inequality. Agents have the capacity to analyze the utility of their choices discounted into an infinite. So this is an assumption that agents have have this mental capacity to do that. And I built that in. That's something we can relax in the future. And taxes are proportional to income, and after the cost of taxation, the remainder gets equally distributed. So the taxes are, in this case, are equally distributed among all classes. They're not, it's not like you take the taxes and give them mostly to the poor, or mostly to the rich, or mostly to some other third party. They get distributed equally. In a revolution, the elites lose everything, and then the poor distribute all the elite income equally among themselves. So that's how they calculate those benefits. So the first thing, of course, I had to do was actually develop it in code, rather than a mathematical, and this is how I've set it up with code, is that first I set the global variables, then in the logic, the agents then, they figure out based on what their average income is, how many are poor, how many are rich, they figure out what the preferred tax rate would be. because if you taxing is not free. So there is a cost to taxation, so that's why there is a curve there and there's gonna be a preferred rate. Then we find, so now they know what they would prefer to get, but they know that if they tax at that rate, they may get a coup, and they don't want a coup. So you then find what is the concession rate that they wanna give in order to prevent coups, and then if it's a non-democracy, you also calculate what is the concession rate for the elites in order to prevent a revolution. Now, in some cases of inequality, there is nothing that the elites, there's no concession rate that's gonna solve it. If the inequality is too high, there's no concession rate, so you automatically are gonna get a revolution or you'll have to democratize. So they go through that, and then the last step is when they actually then go through that analysis, you know, are we now in a democratic, and if not, then is there a tax that would prevent revolution? If not, then they say, is democratization greater than repression? If not, you go ahead and depress. If it is, then you go ahead and democratize. So that's what the rich do. If there is a tax that would prevent revolution, then either you will offer that tax, or you may say, you know what, I don't wanna offer that tax, that's too expensive, I'd rather go ahead and repress, let's get more policemen out there, you know, let's go monitor Facebook, and that's better. And so then they will go ahead and repress instead of offering the concession. And here, if you are a democracy, then the elites are saying, well, is this democracy better? Because if there's a coup, I lose also. Coups are not free. There's a certain percentage of the economy that gets lost in the coup. So is it better for me to pay the taxes, or is it better for me to do a coup? You know, not just this year, but also looking into the future. Then you move down to what the poor, what their set of decisions are. And so even if it is a democracy, the poor can still say, but it's not sufficiently redistributed, so they can still have a revolution. And even if it is, and again also, if it is a democracy, you know, if it's not sufficiently redistributed, they can go ahead and have a revolution. If they're happy with it, then they will go ahead and implement their taxes. It could either be a concession tax or their own preferred tax, depending on what the threat of coup is. Any questions on that? So setting that up,
Oh, it just says, back to the basic model, then do they use basically a different discount rate for the rich and the poor, without, you know?
It's a discount rate, and looking into the future, the discount rate doesn't vary. So when, you know, when you saw that equation about looking into the future, it still is, they just have one value for the discount rate. So as you mentioned, they look at, there are critical values of cost of coup and cost of revolution that determines whether or not they have a revolution or have a coup. And what I did then was to reproduce those critical values and verify that they were the same as what Acemoglu found out mathematically. So I found that out through having agents make decisions and, you know, and calculating that. They found it out mathematically, and we were able to arrive at the same answer. So we did find that democratizations are more likely to occur with a medium level of inequality. Because if there's a high level of inequality, then there's, as much as they want a revolution, there's a high need for a revolution, there's also a high need for repression. And the elites will find it in their best interest to repress. So basically, they said that there's a sweet spot for democratizations, which are more like a medium level of inequality. And that as the discount factor B decreases, democratizations become more likely. And the discount factor is not the same as the discount rate, it's the inverse. So the discount factor would be like 97% if there's a 3% inflation. The discount factor would be 80% if there's a 20% inflation. So as the discount factor decreases, that means as you get more inflation, democratizations are more likely.
Or I just been thinking, I would not have put it in inflation terms, I would have said something like, a discount factor decreasing as people become more impatient, right? Because you're not gonna weigh the future as highly.
You're not, exactly, you
So-
don't weigh the futures.
But if it's
as
interesting,
highly,
it's kind
yes.
of kind of a paradox. So go back to the slide. It says that if in fact the discount factor is high, then you basically have all these perfectly forward-looking people, and that makes democratization unlikely. It's interesting how that works. I mean, there are many of these paradoxes, I think, with the discount parameter, but
There might be.
I guess I'm not sure
So
what
even
exactly
if
what the intuition is for that. But.
Does that mean even if you had say a very stable regime, even if it was very high in inequality, there would be the same democratization as
Unlikely.
Unlikely.
because a stable regime would be a low discount factor.
So there's a bunch of different factors at work. If there is a high discount factor, that means you value the future higher. Democratizations are going to be less likely because the rich have more to gain by keeping the situation the same. Whereas if the future really doesn't matter that much, because who knows, it's all going to shit anyway, then it's they can't, so they're gaining assets every year by all this wealth, but it all gets blown away, because of other things, because if they can't keep that wealth, then it makes a democratization more likely because it's not worth them to fight against it. They can probably make more money in a democratization than out of it. So then, the next things that I tried to do then is figuring out at what point do the models still stay, and at what things can I change? What things do I find where their mathematical model is a little bit too restrictive and doesn't give as much insight into some of these other areas. And they theorize that there's this inverted U shape, which is shown here, where in low levels of inequality you don't get democratization, in higher levels of inequality you do, but if it gets up too high, then you don't get democratizations again. And the result doesn't hold at some levels. You really don't, especially if it's true in general, but if you have a low probability of revolution, so if they're able to repress so much that there's just no probability of revolution, then you never get that sweet spot. You never, even regardless of the inequality, you won't have a revolution. You need to be able to have a credible threat. So this is just looking at how the credible threat, if it's a high probability of credible threat, you get a big area where you might democratize, and as the credible threat of revolution increases, as the credible threat decreases, you get closer and closer and closer to here, where this whole thing is just gonna end up being white. You just go from blue to white if you can't keep, white is repression, blue is status quo, you just keep the non-democracy. And so this is, showing the same thing here. You just go from blue to white. So the first thing I did was to say, well, instead of just having rich and poor, which looks like this first, this was the income distribution of the mathematical models. You have a large group of poor and you have a smaller group of rich. This is the distribution, so let's get a more realistic distribution. So in my agent-based model, I'm able to get, in this particular case, I'm saying 10% of the agents have 30% of the income. And I do cut it off, otherwise it would extend out farther. And an example of that, just so you know, when you say 10% of the agents have 30% of the income, is considered median, in the tables that I've looked at. And examples would be Turkey, India, and the USA.
When you say median, you're talking about if you rank all countries?
Yes.
It's interesting you put those three countries because they're very different.
Yes, I know.
Nominally they are a democracy, but the US is the strongest democracy with strongest institution.
With high, yeah.
India comes next with a strong democracy but weak institutions. And Turkey is actually leaning more autocratic now. And so income is this similar distribution in all of them. Is there some other stuff going on that you can point to?
Clearly, there are other stuff going on, yes.
What metric did you use of inequality? Was it Gini coefficient?
No,
Okay.
that's what,
It's
so.
just that one right there.
I
Yeah,
used
just
that
that
one,
one.
that's the measure I used, that
Okay.
10% of the agents have 30% of the income, and that's the way it was set up in the game theoretic.
Now, income is the yearly income
Yes,
of a
yes,
country.
it does not describe wealth. There are things, you know, they kind of talk about that a little bit in the book, but this is something you can model in an agent-based model, but you really can't mathematically, because it's too complex to do that. And then the second distribution just shows what happens if 10% of the agents have 50% of the income. You know, you get a very different view. Here you have this nice, even at 30%, even at median inequality, you still have a nice middle class. When you have 50% of the income, you have much less of a middle class. And the examples of that is South Africa, Namibia, Haiti.
So would you be changing the distribution through time, or will it, you know, grow an inequality through time? It starts, you know, uniform.
So that is one of the areas of future research, because clearly if you've had a revolution, you now have changed the economic, you know, and the political institutions, and how does that then affect, so what is year over year, how does that then affect the income distribution? And so that's something that certainly they don't do, even though they were looking at repeated games, they don't, you know, once there's a revolution, pretty much the game stops. They don't, that, they didn't really look and see what happens then as that continues on, you know, what is the cumulative effect. So here I just show some of the different examples of results of the A&R model, the mathematical model, base model, versus if, you know, my extensions, or I can now show I have a different income distribution. Even though I have the same metric, I still have, you know, 10% having 30% of the wealth. But I have now a middle class versus just a rich and a poor. And that does change the decision matrix for when you have a revolution and when you don't. And here I'm showing a high probability of a threat of revolution. Democratizations then tend to be less likely when you have a middle class. You would think if you have a middle class, democratization would be more likely. Here I'm saying, no, if there's no middle class, if you just have a lot of really poor people and real rich people without the middle class, you get there's more of a chance of democratization.
How did you agentize, so in the A&R model, it's still basically you have two players. So if you're gonna agentize it, how is each person now a player, and if you have sufficient number of players?
So I can
How do you decide
agentize it,
what's
I
green
have
and
like
white?
10,000 people, I have 10,000, you know, that represent my country.
Right.
And then delta is the percentage of rich versus poor. So so there may be, you know, if I assume 10% of them are the rich, then I would take those out to be the rich, and the rest I would set up as the poor.
I guess what I'm saying is, does each agent play the game?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but in, so I actually do play around with those rules. So they are, if it's a democracy, they're assuming the median voter theorem, which means whoever is the median voter, so not every player has to play, because really the decision comes down to the median voter. So I don't actually have voting in my model. I just need to figure out, okay, this guy's the median voter, given his income, and that does change things, because if I use,
Okay.
but, so there's
So the
a
median
couple of
voter
things.
plays the game,
The
basically.
median
Okay.
voter plays the game. Now, I have changed that in some cases so that the median voter isn't just the only one playing the game. In the A&R model, the median voter is always gonna be a poor agent. In my model, the median voter is gonna be in between his rich and his poor, cause my median voter can have different incomes, and so then it's whatever's in his best interest. But yes, the median voter plays the game. And so, and you can see that, I mean, the shapes are a little bit different. In this case, if there's a high cost of revolution, it's totally insensitive, you get the same value whether there's a middle class or not, which is also interesting, to say that there's the middle class plays no thing. So, then the next thing is, I try to say, rather than just choosing the median voter, so rather than saying everyone is calculating, their infinite utilities and picking the median voter and choosing them, I'm saying, so what if just a fraction of the agents are rational? I mean, this could, or you could say, what if you do vote for a representative, so let's say not everyone chooses the governance, but you say, you vote for your city leader, your tribal leader is the one that chooses the governance, and you let them do all the thinking for the villagers. How does that change things? And so we do find that when you have a few that are rational and all the rest are imitators and they follow the decision of their leader, you get some interesting results. And these, it's not always as predictable. And so there may be cases where it's very clear cut whether you're gonna have a democratization or not. But in real life now, maybe not. Maybe there's some instances, just because of, the way things set up, maybe you do have a democratization and maybe you don't. And that also is much more realistic rather than the very deterministic view that A&R shows with their mathematical model. So my research contribution does show some, that I was able to successfully agentize the very complex A&R game theoretic models in a agent-based model, and I was able to dock it and to reproduce the results. I could show that they were robust in some areas and not robust to some variations of the parameters. I was able to implement extensions so that I can have heterogeneous agents, heterogeneous income, and I can then limit the rationality. So not everyone is calculating their infinite utilities into the future. And, I have a code base, I can now play with it. So the future work is, the partisan politics, how does that play out? Certainly looking at different areas of the economy, because different areas of the economy have different tax and redistributional effects. So it really does affect a lot, and there's a lot of the opportunities may be more restrictive in some of the new areas of the economy just to the rich, where it's difficult for some of the poor people then to participate in across all sectors of the economy. And that's something to be looked at. Let's see, we could endogenize the threat of revolution and coup, and we can endogenize income inequality, as it goes on. I'm gonna have a whole bunch of references, but thank you for your time.
Alright, so I'll go. So you mentioned, so there were two challenges, I guess, for this whole, the problem areas, credible commitment and
Yes.
then collective action.
Yes.
So how are those reflected in the model, that I guess either in the A&R game theoretic model or in your more agent-based version?
So the credible commitment is represented by, when you look into the infinite future, you don't just look at the decision for this year, you calculate your
This is the
benefits.
discount rate.
It's the discount rate, and also what is the probability that could change in the future. What is, so I may get concessions this year, what is the probability that next year I won't get concessions? What is the you know, cause all that depends on your ability to maintain a threat of revolution. You know, what is the probability that, you know, people just get tired? You know, they do. And so that's how that is. And the collective action problem is represented by the cost, it's represented within the cost of revolution. So if it's difficult for people to communicate, I think if people can communicate, we can come together, we can be able to say, you know, if we all work together on this, you know, you're able to then to swing people onto your side. If you squash that, you make it more difficult.
That's
to
the repression,
mount.
cost of repression.
Exactly. But also, yes, so that's the repression, but if there is repression, you can still have a revolution if you have enough, it just makes the cost of that revolution more, because you have to overcome the, collective action problem, which now costs more to overcome.
So there's many ways to conceptualize power, and here it's, you know, the amount of income, I would say. What if it's